AWS certifications won't get you a job. In fact, they could be holding you back. Like many other self-taught cloud engineers, I used to think certifications were very important. I've even done a few myself. But after getting a cloud engineering job at a London bank and guiding many others to do the same, I've learned the reality is very different. So in this video, I'll explain the 3 things you need to consider before your next certification, what you should do instead, and the unique situations where certifications can be beneficial. But first, do hiring managers even care about certifications? So imagine you're a hiring manager looking to fill a customer service job that requires fluent French. 2 candidates come in for an interview. One has a certification from a French language course. The other has no certification but is a native speaker. Which one would you choose? Chances are you'd go with the second person. Why? Because they've demonstrated their skills. And the same idea applies to cloud jobs. Sure, certifications can be a nice way to demonstrate your commitment to learning, but it's not enough. Just like how someone can instantly recognize a native French speaker, an employer can also instantly recognize when someone is able to talk confidently about AWS. And you only get this confidence by working on real projects. Let's say you built a cloud-based app from scratch as a side project, or you've had experience troubleshooting a system outage in the past. You'll naturally be able to talk about this in an interview, and the hiring manager will easily be able to recognize that you really know your stuff. This hiring manager, I think, sums it up quite well. I've conducted interviews in the past from junior engineers to engineering managers. Never did I or anyone else on my team cared about certs. We want to know what type of work you've done, the engineering challenges, and the system design. But you probably heard this already. It's better to build stuff than to focus on theory. Surely certifications have some benefit. After all, having a certification is better than not having a certification, right? Well, I think of it kind of like this. Picture a straight line. This represents the range of opinions that employers have towards certifications. Worst case, or the most negative opinion, on the left side, and best case on the right side. In the worst case, an employer will not look at certifications at all. This is actually becoming more and more common because of something called cert dumping. This is where the questions in the certification exam get leaked and people just memorize the answers without understanding anything. It's like cramming vocabulary words before a language test. Sure, you might pass, but you won't actually be able to hold a real conversation. The best case, as this Redditor puts it, having certifications is like sprinkles on ice cream. It helps if the ice cream is great, but if the ice cream sucks, it won't do anything. So if I told you that in the best case, certifications are just considered a nice to have, is it really worth spending your time and money focusing on it so much? Particularly if your goal is just to get a job? Well, that's up to you to decide. But before you make that decision, you need to consider these 3 things. Do you remember a few years ago, everyone was going crazy for fidget spinners? Like, everyone wanted to buy one, and the market exploded in popularity. And this happens quite often with trends. At first, they seem super valuable and everyone wants to get their hands on one. But as more and more people start to buy them, suddenly they're not so special anymore. Well, I think a very similar thing is happening with AWS certifications. When cloud first started taking off, getting certified in AWS was like having a golden ticket. It showed that you had the skills and the knowledge, and employers valued that a lot. But now cloud computing has become a bit of a buzzword. And as more and more people are getting certified, it gets harder to stand out. What used to be special isn't so special anymore. It's kind of like when everyone in your neighborhood gets a pool. Suddenly, having a pool isn't such a big deal anymore. Plus, employers are starting to get skeptical about what these certifications actually mean. They've probably seen a few certified candidates who couldn't really do much when it comes to actually building stuff on AWS, which then makes them value these certifications less. This is particularly true for entry-level certs like the cloud practitioner. So okay, more people being certified makes certifications less valuable, but it actually makes practical experience more valuable. If you've actually worked on real-world projects using AWS, you'll instantly stand out over someone who just has the certifications. But there's actually an even more important thing you need to consider before you do your next certification. You know how when you're learning to drive, you have to study a manual and take a test to get your license? And it's a big moment when you finally pass. But traffic rules and best practices can change over time. The knowledge you learn for your test might not always be up to date. AWS is kind of like that. AWS services move fast and are updated quite frequently. It's great for staying on the cutting edge, but it can also be hard to stay on top of everything. AWS is changing so fast that even if you get certified, that knowledge can become outdated pretty quickly. It's like trying to use an old study guide from 50 years ago to learn to drive now. Now, yes, AWS does require recertification every 3 years, but even during this time, services may change. You might be learning about services or features that have already been updated or deprecated by the time you take the exam. I mean, sure, you still get the certification, but isn't the whole point of being certified to get relevant and up-to-date knowledge? I'll give you a real example. When I did the AWS Developer Associate, I remember having to learn about AWS Code Commit, but a few months ago, AWS actually announced that they were deprecating that service. This can have a real impact on your career too. Let's say you're applying for a job as a cloud engineer. You've got your AWS certifications and you're feeling pretty confident. But then you get to the interview and they start asking you about services you never even heard of because they were released after you got certified. So while the certifications can be valuable, keep in mind that the knowledge they test can become outdated. But even if the certifications were kept perfectly up to date, there's still something else you should consider. and this one is the most important of the three. So, you know how when you're playing a video game, you can spend a bunch of time and money buying fancy armor and weapons. You think this will make you a great player, but then you actually start playing and get destroyed. Why? Because you didn't actually spend any time practicing the game mechanics. And AWS certifications can be kind of like that. You can sink a lot of money into them buying courses and practice exams, but at the end of the day, you might not actually be better at using AWS in the real world. And it can be quite costly too. Each exam will cost you anywhere from $100 to $300. And that's just for one try. If you don't pass, you're spending even more for retakes. Then there's all the study materials and practice exams. Those can easily add up to a few more $100. Especially if you go for some kind of boot camp, you might be spending thousands. For an engineer paying for all of this themselves, that's a huge cost. But let's say your employer agrees to pay for all of your exams and your study materials. There's still something even more valuable than money that you're losing. Suppose you were offered an investment opportunity with a 5% return versus an investment opportunity with a 10% return. You'd go for the 10%, right? 5% is still good and you're still making money, but it's not the best use of your money. Well, it's a similar situation with certifications. Preparing for these exams takes hundreds of hours of studying and practice. Hours that could be spent actually using AWS to build real projects. You know, you can memorize all the facts about EC2 instances, S3 buckets, but until you've actually used them in a practical way, that knowledge isn't too helpful. And this is really the biggest reason why I think people shouldn't focus on certifications. Your time can be much better spent on many other things that will give you a higher return on time. You actually understand more and retain more and be able to talk about more things in an interview if you focus on building things with AWS. And I think this is probably something that isn't considered enough. You know, we only have a certain amount of time to study technical things. Time you spend on a certification means less time building projects. Now, I'm not saying that certifications are completely useless, just that for most people, especially those looking to break into the industry, there are much better uses of your time. After all, you can always go back and do the certifications later when you're more experienced. But you know, all of this being said, there are actually a few unique situations where I think you should do a certification. So imagine a hiring manager for an entry-level cloud engineering job. They probably get thousands of applications and all of the resumes look very similar. When you have more experience, you would stand out from the other applicants through the projects that you've worked on. But for people without any experience, AWS certifications can be a good feature on a resume. It shows that you've put in some work and dedicated your time to learning the technologies. But to be honest, most of the time, that alone isn't enough. I think the situations where certifications are absolutely the most useful is if you want to work for an AWS consultancy. These firms care a lot about the public image of their employees because at the end of the day, the more skilled their employees look, the more business they can get. This is especially true for consultancies that are official AWS partners. Certifications are even more important to these companies because they have the official recognition from AWS. Being certified here isn't just a boost, it's pretty much a necessity for these companies. And don't just take my word for it though. This Redditor says, your certs are most likely going to matter the most if the company you're applying to is an AWS partner, and that the only reason his company keeps him around is because he's the only thing keeping 3 of their competencies alive. Another Redditor says, consulting firms love us to certify. But what about if you're already in a cloud job? This Redditor says, all the certs I've gotten have been after having a job. They've made me better at my job. And I think this is a pretty important thing. Instead of just focusing on the services that are relevant to what you're working on day to day, you get exposed to a wide range of different services. This big picture understanding lets you build better projects and really makes you a better engineer overall. And so this is where an AWS certification can really accelerate your career. Someone either at the beginning of their cloud computing journey and is interested in joining an AWS partnered consultancy firm, or someone already experienced who's using the certification to fill in gaps in their knowledge. But what if I told you that none of this even matters unless you actually want to be a cloud engineer? Hear me out. Being a cloud engineer isn't the glamorous career that you see on social media. There are actually some important truths you have to accept before you commit to the career. Otherwise, you could risk spending time getting a job and end up hating it. So you can find out why you shouldn't be a cloud engineer in this video.